Hello and welcome to Newsmax TV. I'm David Patton and we're delighted to welcome award-winning economist, scholar, author, and columnist Thomas Sowell, whose landmark book, Intellectuals in Society, has just come out in a revised edition. Dr. Sowell, good to have you with us.
Good to be with you.
Now, in your book, you paraphrase one of my heroes, George Orwell, who said that some ideas are so foolish, only intellectuals would believe them. So could you give us an example of an idea that is widely accepted as presumed truth among today's intelligentsia that is patently foolish to anyone who is not an intellectual?
Well, I guess one of the things you hear a lot about is the notion that we have to raise taxes because there shouldn't be tax cuts for the rich, and the government needs the money. This argument goes back to the 1920s. And it was made under the Coolidge, the Reagan, the Kennedy, and the George W. Bush administrations. The argument for cutting the high tax rate is very straightforward. That if tax rates get above a certain level, you can actually get more revenue by cutting the tax rates than by raising them. The reason being that, of course, the idea that you can soak the rich means that the rich are going to stand still and be soaked, when in point of fact, the record shows that they put their money into tax shelters, and so you have these wonderfully high tax rates on paper, but the government is not collecting any money from it. Now, under those conditions, when you cut the tax rates, you then can increase the revenue, and that's what happened in the 20s. They cut the rate from about 73% to about 24%. And the government collected more revenue, and particularly more revenue from the rich, at 24% than they did at 73%. And this kind of thing has happened over and over again. The converse has also happened, places where you raise the tax rates and the revenue goes down because people don't pay them. Despite how often this has happened, the argument is still the same as it was 80 years ago. And most intellectuals just remain impervious to the evidence. Worse yet, in our schools and colleges, some of the leading textbooks completely misstate what was claimed in the 20s and misstate even more so what actually happened.
Well, now, in your book, you also state that there has probably never been a period in human history where intellectuals have played a larger role in society than we see in ours today. Given some of these misstatements, miscalculations, misunderstandings, why has this happened, and what dangers, if any, does it pose to society at large?
In a sense, I think nobody can really answer that because, but I think the best I can come up with is that the intellectuals control the flow of information. And therefore, most people, even in our leading colleges and universities, are wholly unaware of what has actually happened under various tax policies. And so they're perfectly willing to believe all the nonsense. In Europe, for example, when people try to cut back on some of the control of employers in France on the grounds that they had so many rights, quote unquote, for young workers that employers weren't hiring them. There were riots. People from the Sorbonne were out in the streets trashing it, because they didn't like the idea that employers should be free to fire people when they didn't work out. But of course, if they're not free to fire people, they're very reluctant to hire them. And therefore, you have unemployment rates among young people in France, for example, that have been over 20%.
Well, let me turn to a few issues in the news quickly, if I may. Stockton, California, a city of nearly 300,000 people, is expected to default on some of its bond payments. Other cities and counties are in trouble as well. How big a problem do we have regarding the looming municipal defaults in the months ahead, and how serious would the consequences be in your view?
I think it is far worse to bail them out than to let them default. Default gives people the truth. It tells them that they've spent irresponsibly and that this is the consequence. It means that people who might buy municipal bonds in the future will be a lot more cautious about doing so, and it'll be harder for politicians to raise money by selling bonds. When you come in and rescue them, then of course that means they can keep right on doing the same old thing they've already done. That's true not only for cities, it's true for homeowners, it's true for whole nations. That if people in Germany have to pay for what the money that's been wasted in Greece, then there's less reason for people in Greece to stop wasting money.
Now, this morning there are reports emerging that President Barack Obama is actively talking perhaps to other world leaders about releasing more petroleum from the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve. And that, of course, the objective is to drive down the prices. He is also reportedly pressuring the Saudis to produce more oil. That perhaps will help him politically. But what impact will it have, in your view, on addressing the nation's actual energy problems?
Very little. You can drive down the prices by a few cents for maybe a few weeks, and then all of that goes away. And this resort to the strategic reserve undermines the whole purpose of a strategic reserve. It's there for some catastrophic event where we absolutely have to have oil for the next 30 or 60 days until we can get things straightened out. If you're going to drizzle it out bit by bit every time there's a political reason to do so, then you don't have this big a reserve anymore.
Some have noted that it seems a little ironic, shall we say, that a president who has cut down on the number of oil leases is now touting the fact that the total production of oil in the U.S. is up, that U.S. Dependence on foreign oil imports is down. What's your view of that rather audacious statement on behalf of the administration?
Well, it's this. I love the title of Obama's book, The Audacity of Hope. I call it The Audacity of Hype. It's true that there's more drilling going on now than a few years ago, but all of the drilling that's going on private land under leases signed by the Bush administration and earlier administrations. Obama himself has drastically cut back on federal leases and on drilling on federal land. So he's sort of riding on what other people have done in the past, which is the opposite of what he's doing right now.
Now, aside from higher oil prices, we have seen improved indicators for jobs and in consumer confidence of late. Is it possible that we've finally turned the corner here, or do you think we are inevitably headed for another downturn?
Well, predictions are hard, but I think it's significant that what little economic improvement we've seen has come primarily during the period of so-called gridlock in Washington. And I don't think that's accidental. I think most of the policies that have been followed have been detrimental. And now that you have gridlock in Washington and they can't push these policies anymore, the economy is beginning to recover on its own, as the economy has recovered on its own innumerable times over the past 2 centuries.
Now, you probably heard that yesterday a CBO report came out that sets the 10-year cost of Obamacare, the healthcare initiative, at $1.7 trillion, as opposed to the $900 billion over 10 years the president initially promised. That means that the cost has basically doubled. What's your reaction, and should the CBO be abolished at this point?
I think occasionally the CBO does something that's useful, but by and large, I think it should be abolished. It's one of a number of federal agencies that gives the public a sense of assurance in things where there is no assurance. One of the big problems in the housing crisis was that the law required, the Securities and Exchange Commission required financial institutions to get clearances from rating agencies like Moody's and Standard & Poor's. But the evidence was insufficient for anybody to know what these new mortgage securities were like. And so you're getting false assurances. There was a great economist in Chicago named George Stigler who said many years ago, the investors are better off to be told caveat emptor than to be given false assurances by the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is at the heart of the decline in the financial markets.
So last question, how much damage is the drawn-out GOP primary battle going to cause, in your view, to the eventual candidate in November?
It's hard to say, but I think it's going to exhaust a lot of money. If it's Romney, he has his own money, so it won't be that much of a problem. If it's not Romney, whoever the candidate is going to have to raise an awful lot of money in an awfully short time in order to have any chance at all in the general election.
Dr. Thomas Sowell, author of the fascinating new book, Intellectuals in Society, Thank you so much for joining us on Newsmax TV.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching Newsmax TV.